Hello. In this video, we shall be looking at how you should be planning your reading comprehension preparation. In the last video, we talked about how you should plan your English preparation and how that has 3 dimensions to it: reading comprehension, grammar, and vocabulary. When it comes to reading comprehension, you would know that there are 2 aspects to its preparation. First is how you should read, and the other is how you should be solving questions. Let's start with how you should read these passages. When you regularly practice, have you noticed that oftentimes you don't really pay attention to what you're reading? You are reading something, but it's not really making sense to you because your mind is not really there. This is exactly what we need to counter. And to do this, we need you to develop a habit of mindful reading. In mindful reading, the idea is that you should pay attention. You should process what you are reading as and when you're reading it. This will ensure that you are actively engaging with the passage while reading it. To ensure this, you can also use a few more tricks. One of them, especially to begin with, is to assign subtitles to each paragraph. So when you're reading a passage, you can assign a 3-word and about a 3-word subtitle to each of the paragraphs. While doing this, you will be constantly communicating with yourself and asking yourself as to what each paragraph deals with. This will make sure that you do not lose attention while reading the passage. This will also help you while answering questions, because when you see a question whose answer is likely to be in a particular paragraph, you would know exactly which paragraph to come back to. In the beginning, this might feel like a burdensome exercise. However, with time, you will get used to this and it would not take up additional time. What you can also do is to ask yourself certain basic questions about the passage as you're reading it. For example, what is the subject area that this passage deals with? Where do you think this passage has been taken from? Where have you noticed a similar style of writing? Have you noticed a similar style of writing in newspapers or in books, fictional or non-fictional? Now that we have gone over how you should be mindfully reading the passage, let's integrate these reading strategies with how you should be solving questions. Traditionally, in school, you must have been taught to first read the passage and then answer questions. While this technique may work for many of you, there are other techniques as well that you should all start using in your preparation to see whether or not they work for you. One of these techniques is to first read the questions, then read the passage. Please note that when you read questions, I dissuade you from reading the options as well, because some of the options are going to be wrong, inevitably, and the information that you get from these options might mix up with the information that you're reading from the passage, and this would lead to confusion. Therefore, read only the questions and then read the passage. This would also help you in saving time, because when you're reading the passage, you would know exactly which paragraphs to focus on. You can also skim over paragraphs which have nothing to do with any of the questions in the passage. Moving on, there is another technique with a slight variation in which you can glance over the entire passage in about a minute, then read the questions, and then come back to the passage to do a detailed reading as required. Here, you would have gotten an idea of what the passage is dealing with, which subject area it is from, how difficult it is, what the structure of the passage is, from that 1-minute glance over the passage. Now, when you're reading questions, you will be able to spot factual questions for which you will know exactly which paragraph may have its answer and you can refer it directly. If, for example, you find that the passage is very difficult and so are the questions, then you can also keep this passage for the end and come back into it if there is time at the end of completing the English section or completing all sections of the paper. The next strategy involves reading the introduction of the passage and the conclusion of the passage and then reading questions. What this simple exercise will do is to tell you what the subject area of the passage is, what sort of issues it's dealing with, what the difficulty level is and what you would be expecting in the course of the passage. Then you can solve the questions with a vague idea of what the passage is about, and then for each question you can come back to the passage as required, or you can also read all of the questions and then come back and do a detailed reading of the entire passage. Moving on to the final technique, which we shall be discussing here, which is to read the first and last line of each paragraph. This is similar to the technique of assigning subtitles to each paragraph. Here again, reading the first and last line of each paragraph will give you a sense of what that particular paragraph deals with. So then, when you read the questions afterwards, you will know where you are likely to find the answer of a particular question too, because you will know which paragraph deals with what sort of information. Now that I've discussed a couple of techniques with you, you will not be very fluent with using them the first time itself. You would have to use each of these techniques in a couple of paragraphs. And that will make you adapt with these techniques, or it will tell you that this technique is not really working for you. You may also realize that a mix of more than one techniques works with you. With simpler paragraphs, a certain technique may work for you, and for difficult paragraphs, another technique might work for you. This may also differ according to when you're dealing with a passage from a familiar subject area or a passage from an unfamiliar subject area. That brings us to the next leg of this video, wherein we shall be talking about how to deal with passages from unfamiliar subject areas. For all of us, there are certain subject areas that we really like. For example, I really like reading passages about history. However, some of you may dread that subject area. Many of you, like myself, dread subject areas such as economics and philosophy, even science and technology, and can barely make sense of it. What that does is that when we read the passage, we are extremely slow. The way a normal person would be able to read a philosophy passage, I would not only be slower than that person, but my understanding will also be weaker. So then, what are the ways that you can do to deal with a situation like this? First is to prevent such a situation from happening. How you can do this is by reading as many subject areas as possible and by reading from as many sources as possible. By reading as many subject areas, I mean that read economics to philosophy to history to biotechnology to law to political science, or even sports for that matter. Don't just read things because you have developed an interest in it. One interesting way to incorporate this into your daily practice, which you may already be doing, is to make sure that you read every page of the newspaper. What that does is that you will be reading a little bit of economics, a little bit of sports, a little bit about science, a little bit about world affairs, a little bit about local affairs, and about national affairs as well. This will give you some background information, some basic information about all sorts of subject areas over a period of time. What you should additionally be doing is to read from a number of sources. Don't just read the newspaper, also read fictional books and non-fictional books and magazines. All of this will ensure that you have a foundation in as many subject areas as possible and from as many sources as possible. You would have noticed that the style of writing in a newspaper tends to differ from that of a journal, for example, or of a fictional book. So all of this you have to be prepared for, because CLAT can give you a passage from any of these sources and any of these subject areas. Now, there must be a question in minds of everybody that even if you do this, there might still be unfamiliar subject areas, or at least subject areas that you're still less sure about. For this, when you get a passage from an unfamiliar subject area, you should start with glancing over the questions. Try to gauge the difficulty level of the questions. Then come back and try to gain a broad overview of the passage. See if the key words are defined. Oftentimes, even if it's, say, an economics passage, but they are defining the difficult words, it will be easier for you to make sense of it. What you should also be doing is that you should be reading the passage slowly and patiently, but not getting caught up by the details. It's okay if you do not understand every line of the passage. If it's a difficult passage and the questions are also more or less difficult, then even if you answer 3 questions out of the 5, is still going to be a win for you. So it's just try to gain a broad overview of what the passage is dealing with, and that will give you enough understanding as to how you should be going about questions pertaining to it. What you can also start doing is that you can look for the factual questions in the passage and look for answers to those specific questions if you're not able to make sense of the entire passage. With that done, we have discussed how you should be mindfully reading the passage, what sort of strategies you can use to integrate mindful reading with solving questions and reading the questions, and lastly, how you should be dealing with unfamiliar subject area passages. Thank you.